welcome to a new video, this time with the renowned near-death researcher Dr. Pim van Lommel. Dr. van Lommel, thank you very much for being my guest.
You're welcome.
Dr. van Lommel, you were a senior cardiologist at a clinic in the Netherlands, and you did one of the largest scientific studies on near-death experiences. Could you please begin by summarizing what is a near-death experience and what are the most important findings of your study?
Yeah, that's an important question. Thank you. First of all, the near-death experience is the reported memory of a period of a very special state of enhanced consciousness with universal elements like being out of the body, being aware of being dead, being in a dark space, being in a tunnel, coming to a non-earthly dimension with beautiful colors, beautiful landscapes, meeting deceased relatives, having a life review, so you relive your own life, meeting a being of light, sometimes have a flash forward, and then coming to a border where you know when I cross this border, I will not come back. Then you usually hear a voice. That's not your time yet. You have to go back. You have still a task to fulfill, and they have your conscious return into the body. So that's the typical near-death experience. Not all the universal elements will be reported. And these near-death experiences happen, what we know, in cardiac arrest. So people with a cardiac arrest, what we call clinical death, can report this near-death experience. There's also other life-threatening circumstances like severe loss of blood in complicated childbirth in young women. You can have it in traumatic brain injury after traffic accident or a stroke. You can have it in near drowning in children. You can have it in the end phase of life. We call end-of-life experience of deathbed visions. There are also other circumstances where NDE-like experience can happen, like in severe depression and isolation. Some astronauts like Glenn and Mitchell had these meditation or without any obvious reason. And the main aspect of this near-death experience is the transformation. All patients change. That's the first is there's no fear of death anymore. They believe in a continuity of consciousness. Death is not the end of who you are. There's new insight what is important in life. It's all about empathy and compassion and unconditional love, first towards yourself, accept your own negative aspects, we all have. And the third aspect is enhanced intuitive sensitivity. It's very reluctant patients are reluctant to talk about it because they know what other people think and feel. Now what we did, and I am a cardiologist, so I was a privilege to meet people who survived a cardiac arrest. And in 1986, I read a book by George Ritchie, Return from Tomorrow. And George Ritchie was a medical student in 1943 who died of double pneumonia. And there were no antibiotics available for this medical student. So he died. It was declared dead, and his body was covered with a sheet. And the nurse was so upset that this medical student had died that she was able to persuade the medical doctor to give him an injection of adrenaline right into his heart, which was quite uncommon in that time. And after being dead for 9 minutes, he came back in his body. And he reported a very deep, very intense near-death experience, but also aspects like out-of-body experience in a bar several hundred miles from where he was, also in dark spaces as well. And I was so impressed by this book, you can read it in one evening. It's a very impressive story, that I started to interview in 1986 on patients who survived the cardiac arrest if they had memories from the period of unconsciousness, from the period of cardiac arrest. And within 2 years, I had 50 patients ask this question who survived cardiac arrest. And of these 50 patients, 12 reported an NDE with me. And that's the moment my scientific curiosity started to grow, because it was, according to our current medical knowledge, it's impossible to experience consciousness when the heart stops, when the brain stops functioning, when the breathing stops. So you should be unconscious, totally unconscious. So for me, it was scientific curiosity to understand how is this possible that people still can have enhanced consciousness with the possibility of perception out and above the lifeless body, to meet deceased relatives, to have cognition, memories, etc. So that's the reason we start with some other conference, people like two psychologists, a prospective study in the Netherlands in 1988. And we studied 344 consecutive survivors of cardiac arrest in 10 Dutch hospitals. And we found in these 344 patients that 18% reported a near-death experience and 82% did not have any memory at all. Now we compared the two groups, the group with and without an NDE after cardiac arrest, and to our surprise we found no difference at all. If they have a cardiac arrest of 2 minutes or 8 minutes, it doesn't matter at all. If they haven't been unconscious for 5 minutes or 3 weeks in coma, it didn't matter at all. If they have a cardiac arrest in a cath lab, in electrophysiological stimulation studies, and usually they're defibrillated within 20 to 30 seconds, it doesn't matter at all. So anoxia, lack of oxygen in the brain, didn't play any role in the explanation for the cause of an NDE. All patients in our study had been unconscious because of anoxia, lack of oxygen in the brain, and only 80% reported near-death experience. And also other possible explanations like give a medication, didn't matter at all. A psychological explanation like fear of death, didn't matter at all. Foreknowledge, that you know that these experiences are possible, doesn't matter at all. Gender, age, doesn't matter at all. Religion, if they were Christian or atheist or Muslim, doesn't matter at all. So the main conclusion of this study, which was published in the Lancet in 2001, and the Lancet is one of the most important international medical journals, it was that there is no medical physiological explanation why people have a near-death experience. And the second part of the study was a longitudinal study that we did taped interviews 2 years and 8 years after the cardiac arrest with all patients with any who still were alive, and a matched control group of patients who survived the cardiac arrest without any memory. And matched control group is that we had the same gender, the same age, and the same time interval. And what we found, and it was a study about the transformation, and that never had been studied before in a prospective design. And what we found that only patients with a near-death experience had this classical transformation. No fear of death anymore, no insight of what is important in life, and enhanced intuitive sensitivity. And so this longitudinal study about transformation is the objective aspect, what we could statistically prove for a subjective experience, because subjective experience you cannot prove at all. So this was a very important study, still the largest study ever done, and it's still the only study with statistical analysis. And it was published in the Lancet in 2001, and it gave a worldwide stir. It was on all front pages all over the world.
So you have primarily studied near-death experiences that occurred during cardiac arrest, which can last 2 minutes or 5 minutes or even longer. And some people say that the near-death experience happens shortly before cardiac arrest or later when the patients wake up again.
Yeah, that is an important question as well. You know, because patients who have an out-of-body experience, they can report exactly what happens. They can have, from a position out and above the body, can see their own CPR, cardiopulmonary resuscitation from above. They know what the doctors and nurses tell them, each other, what they say, what they think even. And they, so they can perceive from above, and they can describe the resuscitation room from a position above. And later you can corroborate this theoretical perception. So you can ask doctors and nurses and family members what really happened at which moment. And then you know that the NDE with out-of-body experience happened during the cardiac arrest, during the moment that people were unconscious. And there have been a study done recently, a book, The Self Does Not Die, with 125 cases of corroborated theoretical perception. Another study by Jen Holden from Irons with 80 patients. So more than 200 cases have been written down. And what we found that with an out-of-body experience, and when you corroborate these theoretical perceptions, that 95% of what the people told was really what happened during cardiac arrest, during coma, during general anesthesia. So that means that what he perceived really happened. That cannot be, the definition cannot be no hallucination or delusion of illusion. It really happened. And that's a very important aspect.
So, due to the fact that they can often describe exactly what actually happened during this time over several minutes, we can deduce that the near-death experience did not happen before cardiac arrest or in the waking phase, but really exactly during the time of cardiac arrest.
Right. When people come back from the cardiac arrest, then they see doctors and nurses around them that, what are you doing here? They didn't know that they had a cardiac arrest, and they're usually just not clear thinking, just what happens and etc. So they don't, while in the death is a very clear memory, very clear. And the other aspect is, which is very important. So the question is, what happens in the brain during cardiac arrest? So what happens in the brain? And there have been studies done as well with patients with EEG registration. EEG is the registration of the electrical activity of the cortex of the brain. And they did it in patients with threshold testing of internal defibrillators, but also when there was surgery with an EEG registration of the patient, when the patient had a cardiac arrest during surgery. What you see, and they also did some kind of induced cardiac arrest studies in dogs with EEG. But you see that when the heart stops, you measure the blood flow over the carotid artery. The flow is zero within 1 second. There's no blood going to the brain within 1 second. The people get unconscious within 2 or 3 seconds. And then the body reflexes, which is a function of the cortex of the brain, are totally gone. So the body doesn't react anything. It's not reacting at all. The brainstem reflexes are gone. So the gag reflex, you put a finger in someone's throat. You have the corneal reflex or fixed dilated pupils. They're all gone. And the breathing stops. The breathing center is close to the brainstem. So the clinical findings are there is no activity of the brain at all. When you have the EEG registration, you see a flatline EEG within 10 to 20 seconds. And when you have a CPR, cardiopulmonary resuscitation in the coronary care unit, it always takes 2 to 4 minutes before there's a successful resuscitation. So all patients in our study, and there have been 4 other prospective studies in patients with cardiac arrest, a total of 562 survivors of cardiac arrest. And between 10 and 20% of those patients reported in NDE. That means that there still was a possibility to report an enhanced consciousness at the moment that the brain didn't function at all, and it was a flatline EEG. And it is also, of course, a surprising conclusion, because according to current medical science, it should be impossible. Because we still believe in what you learned in school, what I learned in school, what I learned in university. The people still believe that consciousness is a product of brain function. So because of this scientific studies on near-death experience, we have to discuss again the never proven assumption that the brain produces consciousness.
According to my observations over the past 10 years or so, some people repeatedly claim that the brain is still alive or active despite cardiac arrest, because there was, I think in 2018, this study with mice where it was discovered that the heart stops, brain activity drops to zero, and then at some point there is a so-called death wave in the brain. And since then, some people have repeatedly suggested that the brain is generally still active during cardiac arrest. What do you think of this?
First of all, what I told you before, I have never been seen an activity in the EEG after 10 to 20 seconds in cardiac arrest patients. But perhaps this neurologist refers to 3 studies where EEG registration has been done in dying patients. Patients were on the ECU, intensive care unit. They were dying, have severe damage of the brain, had epilepsy, etc. And then because they thought the people who died, they stopped artificial respiration, they stopped medication. And then the blood pressure drops slowly, the breathing doesn't come back or not. And so in this process of the dying process you can see still some activity in the EEG. But the articles that has been published, and there you still see tachycardia, so still cardiac rhythm during this phase. But when the heart stops, there's a flatline EEG. So the dying process in this, there are only, I think, no more than 10 patients in 3 studies done. The dying process in these people with severe damage in the brain without any support by artificial respiration, you can see still some activity in the brain before the cardiac arrest occurs. And there have been several patients also where there was even a flatline before the cardiac arrest started. So it's a very selective reference to some studies who are not important for studies of near-death experience. And there has been last year a study published. I was one of the co-authors. It's called Near-Death Experience in Cardiac Arrest and Conscious Beyond the Brain, a Narrative. It was republished in the International Review of Psychiatry. And all the studies I mention now and you ask for are mentioned, and also critical remarks about this study, because it's not for the study of near-death experience very important at all. Also, rats cannot talk about near-death experience, and patients who are dying in the ICU with a very damaged brain cannot talk anything.
Well, it is probably true that when living beings, humans or animals, finally die, there is still some activity. But when people have survived cardiac arrest and then report such an experience, it is certain to say that there was no or no sufficient brain activity during the period of cardiac arrest.
No, it is within 10 to 20 seconds there's a flatline over. And in the animal studies that was done with the EEG, so also the deeper structures of the brain stop functioning within 10 to 20 seconds. So in animal studies also the deep structures of the brain stop functioning. And to experience consciousness, you have the global neuronal workspace. That means to experience consciousness, as we're sitting here now in awakened consciousness, you need several neuronal centers who exchange information, have communication with each other. And this kind of global neuronal workspace is not available at all during cardiac arrest. And the consciousness that people report in NEs is not our waking consciousness, but it's a totally different kind of consciousness. It's out of the body. You have perception out of the body. You have memories from early childhood, which you normally don't have. So you can meet deceased relatives. And that means also that the consciousness of the deceased relatives are still to be encountered.
And then there is another point that is not mentioned at all in some reports about NDEs, and that is the issue of general anesthesia. As you have shown in your study, like other researchers, NDEs are not only experienced during cardiac arrest, but also relatively often when these patients are under general anesthesia, even deep general anesthesia. Isn't that in itself proof that these experiences cannot be generated in the brain, because general anesthesia alone should make something like that impossible, isn't it?
When you have general anesthesia in a patient, there's still activity in the brain. Like in deep sleep, there's still activity in the brain, but you don't have waking consciousness because the communication between the several neural centers is blocked. And general anesthesia gives a blocking of the information exchange between the several neural centers. But we have a cardiac arrest during general surgery. Then you have the flatline EEG, and then you have the NDE, near-death experience. So it's another factor which explains that it should not be possible at all. And then what people report is the out-of-body experience. They can see their own surgery from above. And you can see the doctors, the surgeon and the nurses from a position out and above the body, which is not possible. The eyes are closed during general anesthesia. You cannot see, let alone from a position out of body. And also in CPR, patients in cardiac arrest have closed eyes and they still can perceive from a position out and above the body. So consciousness is not located in the brain and in the body during cardiac arrest.
Normally, when you wake up from general anesthesia, you can't remember anything from that time.
No memory at all.
So the brain can be active without having any consciousness.
That's the sense. Where is your consciousness when you are asleep? Where is your consciousness? It's always there, but you don't receive it into your body. So my idea is now that the brain does not produce consciousness, but it has a facilitating function, not a producing function. That means the brain is like an interface or a transceiver or a filter. So consciousness is non-local, beyond time and beyond space. When people report a near-death experience, they can report everything what happens in their life, with also what happened in the consciousness of other people in the past who were connected with them. But each act, each word and each thought you ever had is kept forever in this non-local realm, where the consciousness is beyond time, beyond space. You can have also future events. So in this non-local realm, where consciousness always is, there's no time, no space, and everything happens at the same moment. Where you have a cardiac arrest of 5 minutes, and you have had a life review, you can talk a week for everything what you saw in your life review. So because everything happens at the same moment. When you think of somebody, you will meet him and you have exchange of thoughts. And when you think of a place, you will be there at the same moment. So everything happens at the same moment. That's what we call it, why we call it a non-local consciousness. And it is always there. And to understand how this works, I compare it with the worldwide communication. At this very moment where you are, there are hundreds of thousands of telephone calls going through you and through your room. There are hundreds of television programs and radio programs going through you and through your room. But you need a mobile phone or a radio or a television to receive some of these electromagnetic informative fields. And the internet with 1 billion websites is now going through you and through me and through the rooms everywhere. And you need to function a laptop to receive by special code some of these internets or websites of YouTube films. But your computer does not produce it, it receives it. And it's the same with the brain. The brain doesn't produce consciousness, but it receives it. And consciousness is always there, it's fundamental. Everything starts from consciousness, and consciousness together with energy and information, fundamental in the universe. It was the first. And everything comes from consciousness. So also your body is formed from consciousness. That's why people in the end stage of Alzheimer don't remember a lot of things, and they can even don't recognize their children. But it can happen that just before they die, they get clear again, and they sit up in bed, recognize the children, call them by name, thank them, and die. It's called terminal lucidity, which should be impossible because the brain is just one total mess in the end stage of Alzheimer. The other aspect is after-death communication, that in the first weeks, days, weeks, of months after the death of a loved one, you are in contact with the consciousness of this deceased relative. In Holland, there's about 2 million people. In Europe, 125 million people have after-death communication. Usually the people say, I had a dream of him or her. Because it's not a dream, because you never forget it. It's always very impressive. You can have objective information about where the keys are, whatever, books are, what other things, but which cannot be known. So when there is an after-death communication, it means that consciousness is still there, but not in the physical realm. It's always there.
And one final question about near-death experiences. How do you explain the fact that most people do not remember a NDE after cardiac arrest?
Yeah, that's also an important question. Well, in our study, with a mean age of 62 years old, was 18% of those patients reported a near-death experience. When we divided the patients in under the age of 60 and above the age of 60, the patients under the age of 60 had more NDEs than the older group. There's one prospective study in children under the age of 5 with a near-death experience by Melvin Morse. He found that more than 70% of those children had a near-death experience. And retrospective studies in traffic accidents, in coma, between 30 and 40 years old, about 30 to 40% of those patients have a near-death experience. So the older you are, the less NDEs are reported. Now we know that small children under the age of 5, 6 have an open consciousness. They see friends, we don't see them, and they can communicate with other people. So they're open. And after the age of 6, because of school and society, they lose this contact of invisible friends, but they're still open. So the NDEs are more often, because the connection between the body and consciousness is loose. But the older you are, the connection is more strict. So the older you are, it takes more time to get out of your body, to get consciousness leave the body. And so when you're old, in our study, about 80% had the NDE, but they are resuscitated within 5 to 10 minutes. And perhaps it takes 10 minutes, 50 minutes or 30 minutes before they leave the body. Everybody who dies will have a death experience. But it takes more time when you're old than 5 minutes or 10 minutes. That's the reason. And what we did in our longitudinal study, we compared the patient with cardiac arrest with and without an NDE. So only the patient with an NDE had the transformation. The people who did not report an NDE did not have the transformation. That means it's an objective proof for subjective experience. And we know from children under the age of 5, let's say when you have complicated childbirth, so an NDE at birth or very, very young age, near drowning or coma by traffic accident, those children don't remember the NDE, but they all have the transformation, they all have enhanced intuition. So the transformation is a proof for children who don't remember the NDE, but they're different from other children. I write it also in my chapter 5 of my book as well, from NDEs in children. They're not aware of the NDE, but they're different from other people. When they don't remember, I presume usually that they didn't have an NDE, but there are some exceptions. I have read some patients who had been close to death and didn't really remember, but doubting a little bit, and under hypnosis, they remembered some aspects of the NDE. So it can happen that during hypnosis you can remember something. But these patients had already some transformation as well. And the problem is, I know that most neuroscientists and also neurologists are very reluctant to be open to this new insight. The problem is with consciousness and the current materialist science, that in current materialist science, only that is true, but you can objectify, what you can measure, what you can duplicate, and what you can falsify, that it is true. But consciousness, what you think and what you feel, you cannot objectify, you cannot measure, you cannot duplicate, you cannot falsify. Just for the materialist scientist, consciousness doesn't exist at all. It's just the same as the brain. And that's the problem. So they are not, and science for me is asking questions with an open mind. And when there are new findings in science, you can say, or it is impossible, or you have to change science. You have to, what we call a paradigm shift. And that happens with quantum physics. It took 80 years before quantum physics was generally accepted. It takes a long time. And Max Planck, the founder of quantum physics, once have said, don't try to convince people about your new theory, but wait until they die and the new generation will be open and accept it as normal. And that's what's happening also this time. So we have to expand science into the post-material science and to include subjective experience. And that's what's happening worldwide now. But I understand that people in universities are reluctant to be open for it. I've met some professors who tell me personally, you could be right, but openly they say this total nonsense until they retire. And then they said, what I've said in the past was wrong, but they're afraid for the position on the universities, they're afraid for the research money, etc. So officially they say it's nonsense, and they still keep on looking in the brain to find consciousness somewhere, but they will never find it.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lommel, for your explanations. It was a pleasure having you for this channel, and I wish you all the best.
Okay, thank you. Well, you're welcome. Bye.